Hey there, it's Tom Ryan, founder and CEO of ICR. Before we get into the next episode, I wanted to ask that you subscribe to the show. It'll help us get even more unique and interesting guests on the podcast and in turn continue to educate management teams and the growing ecosystem that creates value for fast-growing private and public companies. And while you're at it, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating. Very much appreciated.
I think the bigger problem that I'm seeing right now in corporate boardrooms is a reluctance to even talk about China.
Political headwinds have made it hard for American firms to do business in China. And even though many companies seem content to ignore the issue, it's not going anywhere.
Regardless of how the tariff conflict turns out, China's going to continue to be the world's second largest consumer market. It's going to continue to be the source of these critical minerals. It is going to continue to be a key part of global supply chains.
My name is Tom Ryan, and this is Welcome to the Arena, the ICR podcast. Each week, I sit down with today's business leaders to give you an inside scoop on some of America's most prosperous public companies, their origins, their challenges, and the keys to their success. Andy Rothman is the founder and CEO of Sinology, a consulting firm that provides advice to institutional investors and companies on the opportunities and risks presented by China's economy and the impact of changes on U.S.-China relations. Given the new administration's tariff policy and the global unease we've seen in recent months, I can't think of a better time to pick the brain of someone who spent decades studying China's economy and its evolving relationship with the United States. Let's enter the arena with Andy Rothman. So, Andy, I wanted to ask you before we get into this, where did you grow up and how did you kind of catch this China bug?
It was entirely accidental. So I grew up in New York City area, and I went to college in upstate New York at Colgate.
Yep.
And didn't really have any interest in China, but I had an economics professor who was from China. And in 1979, the U.S. and China reestablished diplomatic relations. And the next year, he got a grant to take a small group of students to China and asked me if I wanted to go. And I remember calling my parents, and my mother said, "But you don't even like Chinese food." Or at least what passed for Chinese food in the U.S. back then.
Yeah.
So I traveled around with this professor for a month in 1980. And I think it was because it was my first time outside of North America. I just got hooked. It was so fascinating. And then when the State Department offered me a job a few years later, they said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, how about teach me Chinese and send me there?" And they said, "Great, nobody wants to do that."
It's so funny how life kind of pans out, and here you are today. Is this one of the more complex times you've seen in your career as an advisor to companies and institutional investors on kind of what's going on in China?
It is. It's complex, and it is also uniquely difficult and different in that, especially in the United States right now, there's a lot of fear or caution about even talking about China in the boardroom.
Yeah.
Because of the political overhang on that. And that's not something that appeared before, and it's not something that I find when I talk to companies and investors outside the U.S. So I'm actually spending a lot more time on Zoom calls with companies in Europe, in the Middle East, in South America, and Asia than I am here in the U.S. And I think that's something that American companies need to be careful about.
Yeah, I would think so too. For people who really aren't that well versed in China, maybe you could just set the table in a macro sense of what's happening in China right now, like their economy, specifically their GDP, their global aspirations. What kind of relationship do you think they would ideally want to have with the United States and the rest of the world?
That's a great way to start. Maybe a good way to begin answering that question is to note that when I was back in China last month, I didn't hear any anti-American sentiment, any anger towards the U.S. or towards the Trump administration at all. And that kind of surprised me because I remember going back there after the balloon incident. You remember when that spy balloon mistakenly came over the U.S. and got shot down? I had some Chinese officials cancel my meetings with me just because I was an American and they were nervous about meeting an American. There was none of that this time. In fact, if anything, I think more people wanted to talk to me.
Interesting.
In the government, in the private sector, just to say, "Hey, you're an American. What's going on over there with all this now?"
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of misperceptions here in the U.S. about China. For example, when I first worked in China as a junior American diplomat in the early 1980s, there were no private companies at all. You couldn't even find a privately run restaurant. Now, about 90% of employment in China is entrepreneurial, privately owned companies.
It's amazing.
I think if your listeners were to do what I did last month in Xiamen, a city that probably they haven't heard of but has a population bigger than LA, I spent 2 days just talking to entrepreneurs, visiting their factories, hosting lunches and dinners. I think it would be a really familiar conversation for people who've started their own business here in the US. They have the same aspirations and the same problems. And it's become a really entrepreneurial place, a really market-driven place. When I first went to China, all prices were set by the government.
Yeah.
Now, almost all prices are set by the market. And they want the same thing we want. When I go and visit government officials, they're all telling me, well, my kid's about to graduate with an economics degree at Carnegie Mellon. Do you have any idea where she could get a good job? And these are senior Communist Party officials. So they're increasingly very much like us, and they want to get along with us. Doesn't mean that there aren't big cultural differences, and obviously there are enormous political differences.
Yep.
But it's not the Soviet Union reborn. This is a country that has gotten rich. For example, when I first worked in China, per capita income was lower than it was in Haiti and Afghanistan.
Wow.
Now it's one of the wealthiest places in China. Now it's driving all things like EVs and AI, right? And luxury goods. These are people who want to send their kids to school here.
Yeah.
And have been doing that, and who want to have a better life and who want to get on with us. And I think we're missing an opportunity here right now by not understanding that.
In terms of their economy, how much is domestic demand driven now versus exports? At least my perception, and I'm obviously not an expert, is that they're so incredibly reliant on exports. If the tariffs come, their whole economy falls apart. But I don't think that's the case, right?
That's right. And I think President Trump's been getting a lot of bad advice from his team on this. I understand the misunderstanding, because if you go to the store in the US, it looks like everything comes from China, right? So they must be just sitting there making stuff for us.
Yep.
In the 5 years before COVID, net exports contributed on average 1% of China's GDP growth. Over 60% came from domestic consumption.
Yeah.
Now that's different because of COVID and because the Chinese government's done a lot of stupid stuff on the regulatory side. So domestic confidence has been down. Last year, net exports contributed 30% of China's growth. So what Xi Jinping, I think, is focused on right now is getting back to where it was before COVID, where exports are kind of on the margins. And then the other way to think about this is that of all the Chinese exports last year, only 15% came to the United States. So last year, China's exports to the US were 2.8% of its GDP.
Wow.
So when people are telling President Trump that, well, the Chinese will cave into you because they're so dependent on our market,
probably not.
Well, isn't really working out that way. I think that's why the Trump administration backed down in Geneva a couple of weeks ago negotiating with China.
Do you think you're going to continue to see this kind of easement or de-escalation or whatever you want to call it? Because they're going to go back to the table and try and do something. Obviously, both parties need to save face. That's kind of how I always look at it. How do you think it all ends up?
Yeah, there's two scenarios here. If you listen to President Trump, he has said repeatedly that he likes and respects Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. He wants to have a constructive relationship with China. And the Chinese are saying the same thing.
Yep.
They want to get out of this problem of the tariff conflict. And when I was in Beijing last month, people were saying they were frustrated that up until Geneva, which was after my trip, they hadn't been able to get the Trump White House on the phone.
Wow.
So now they're talking, so that's a good sign. I think there's room for compromise, but I think the holdup is likely to not be over tariffs. It's more likely to be over technology.
Yeah.
Because while President Trump himself is saying he wants to have a good relationship with China, the guys underneath him are continuing to put out rules and regulations designed to hold back and trip up China's tech development in AI, in semiconductors, in EVs and batteries. And so I think when they sit down again, the Chinese are going to say, okay, let's talk about trade, but let's also talk about your efforts to try and hold us back. That's not right.
Yep.
And if you're not willing to back off of those export controls, which are designed to strangle our tech industry. Why should we do a trade deal with you? So I think President Trump's instinct will be to say, yeah, let's pull back on that stuff. On tech, we're going to focus on doing a better job at home and outcompete you rather than trying to trip you when you're running down the road. But President Trump is surrounded by people who see China as an enemy and who want to pursue this more aggressive proposal. And it's going to be important because, as you mentioned, while the tariffs have come down, and it's fair to call it a tax or a tariff,
Yeah.
the average tax on U.S. imports from China is somewhere between 40 and 50%. And one of the things that the president's advisors didn't really think through with this is, okay, let's use tariffs to bring high-end manufacturing back to the United States, but over what period of time? So right now you're looking at the fact that almost all baby stuff, strollers, cribs, things like that, comes from China.
Yeah.
Almost all dog toys come from China. But more importantly, laptops and machinery. A lot of what we import from China is intermediate goods and machinery that goes into factories to make stuff with American labor. And that's going to be more difficult or expensive under this. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in the coming months on the Trump administration to pull back.
Interesting. In terms of like U.S. companies with significant exposure to China, how are they generally thinking about their supply chain?
It obviously varies a lot from company to company and based on the industry. There are some supply chains where there's no alternative. Like another one of the things that we haven't thought through well in Washington is most critical minerals that are important for energy, for semiconductors, for radar, for the F-35. Those minerals are almost all processed overwhelmingly in China.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to be in a tariff war with China, how do we get gallium when like 98% of the world's gallium processing takes place in China? But I think the bigger problem that I'm seeing right now in corporate boardrooms is a reluctance to even talk about China.
Yeah.
Because, normally when we talk about supply chains or markets, it's a very fact-driven process, right? Where can we get the most bang for our buck? Where can we do the best for our shareholders? But now you've got this political overlay of, some of us hate China because we're told we should hate China and we're told they're the enemy.
Yeah.
And so I worry that the chaos of tariff conflict and the distraction of things like, is China going to invade Taiwan? I think this is keeping many companies from having a solid conversation and a good thought process about what China is going to mean for their business over the next couple of decades. That regardless of how the tariff conflict turns out, China is going to continue to be the world's second largest consumer market, the world's fastest growing consumer market. It's going to continue to be the source of these critical minerals. It is going to continue to be a key part of global supply chains. So we really ignore China at our peril if we're too bogged down on the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the interview with Elon Musk on CNBC yesterday, but he was talking about the speed at which China is building power plants, and they're like at escape velocity compared to the US.
I saw parts of that interview, but I was paying more attention, I think, this week to several interviews that Jensen Huang, the founder and CEO of NVIDIA, did.
Yeah.
Where he was talking about how half of the world's AI engineers are Chinese and how much, I think he said 50 billion in lost revenue for NVIDIA in China because of the government sanctions. So when we think about restrictions and we then say, well, if NVIDIA can't make as much money selling into China, if Qualcomm can't make that money, if Intel can't make that money, how do they invest in R&D for the future? And also, are we going to create a world where there's a separate ecosystem for, say, AI and semiconductors and quantum computing in China and then one for the US?
Yeah.
Who comes out atop of that, given that most countries in the world, including most of our allies and partners, do more trade with China today than they do with the United States?
Andy mentioned Taiwan earlier and the fears that China will mount a military invasion. I wanted to get his take on the likelihood of that actually happening and how the specter of conflict could impact business investment.
Certainly, if China was to use military force against Taiwan, that would be massively destabilizing, not only for Asia and for anybody's business there, but for the whole world.
Yeah.
But I think the risk of that happening is extraordinarily low. And this is being hyped way out of proportion in the media and by also some people who use this because this is a way to get more government spending on military here.
Yeah.
If you look at a few things, I think there's reasons to not be very worried about that. One is domestic politics in China. There is no political pressure at home on Xi Jinping to attack Taiwan. And also the risks are enormous. I mean, look how Putin has been bogged down with a land border between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Here we're talking about 100 miles of difficult water and whether the U.S. might get involved. Also, the economic ramifications and risks would be huge. China depends on imports for things like semiconductors, oil, iron ore, soybeans. That would all be cut off. So even the Trump administration is damping that down. They published a threat assessment just a couple of months ago saying only that China is going to continue to put pressure on Taiwan for unification, but they didn't say they would attack.
Yeah.
The head of the U.S. Pacific Forces said the other day that this 2027 date that people are throwing around for an invasion is just a date when Xi Jinping has told his military to be capable of fighting a war, not that they plan to do it.
Yeah, interesting. Switching to institutional investors, particularly in emerging markets, every investor around the world needs to monitor China. What signals should they be looking for when measuring maybe the health of the Chinese economy?
So there's a couple of things to follow. One is the Chinese government publishes every month a survey of consumer sentiment, and that sentiment index collapsed during the Shanghai COVID lockdown a couple of years ago and has not recovered. When that confidence comes back among Chinese consumers, they will start to draw down on the massive increase of household savings.
Yep.
That increase in savings is equal to 11 trillion US dollars. That's just the increase. So that's more than double the size of Japan's GDP that's just been added to family and small company bank deposits since the beginning of 2020. So how does confidence come back? I think that President Trump is offering Xi Jinping an opportunity to make China great again by putting pressure on China's exports, which are already a small part of the economy. He is, I think, going to accelerate and deepen two major reform processes that are underway but are too slow right now in China. One is Xi Jinping re-embracing private companies, the entrepreneurs in China who drive all the innovation and growth and jobs. The second is getting him to accelerate policies that are focused on building up domestic demand, local domestic consumption over both production and exports. We've started to see this change since last fall, and I think it's going to accelerate over the coming quarters as a result of the pressure from President Trump, regardless of how the tariff dispute gets settled. So I think you're going to see over the coming quarters this emphasis from government policy, which means that Chinese companies selling goods and services to Chinese people. And remember, income growth is still running at 5% year over year in China. So it's not collapsed.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see domestic demand really take off in what's already the world's fastest growing consumer market.
In terms of Western companies, trying to maintain relationships with Chinese counterparts during this government tension or whatever you want to call it, should executives be going to China and meeting with their counterparts and kind of business as usual, open communication? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, great question. So there's two elements of this. One is executive boards need to continue having open and thoughtful conversations about China as part of their supply chain, as a home of future competitors, as a potential market, and they need to be going. So even if a firm is not ready to make a significant investment there or start selling there, building up relationships and getting a deeper understanding, going over and meeting with people in your industry, going over and meeting with academics who are important source of knowledge, but also who communicate with policymakers on their specialties so that they're familiar with what you do. There's just no substitute for being on the ground there. I lived there for more than 20 years, and now I go back generally once a quarter. And even with spending this much time in China, I'm still surprised and learning a lot of things every time I go back.
Andy, how about the demographic challenges facing China? I read a lot about that. Birth rates all over the world are declining, but is the demographic challenge for China a real thing?
It is a real challenge, but we have to put it in context that it's a slow-moving challenge.
Yep.
So they're facing kind of the same thing that we're facing here in the U.S., where fertility rates are down, the workforce is shrinking. Here in the U.S., we benefit from immigration. And so we do have labor force increases primarily through immigration, and China does not have that.
Yep.
So the workforce has been shrinking there, and this has put pressure, but it's also created opportunities. So, for example, the Chinese government, when I started working there, was keen to just create as many jobs as possible, regardless of how good those jobs were or how much they paid. Now they're perfectly happy to see firms take shoes and toys and other low-value added manufacturing out of China to places like Vietnam and Malaysia and Cambodia. So since Xi Jinping became head of the government and the party in 2012, the number of university graduates has grown by 75%.
Really?
Yeah, so they're really focused on moving up the value chain.
And then how about China's capital markets? How do you see their capital markets evolving with all of this growth over the next couple of decades?
I think it's going to continue to mature. We have to remember that it's a pretty young capital market. It's only been around a few decades.
Yep.
And so they've gone through a lot of the same stumbles that we went through in the early days of our capital markets. But it's a lot better regulated now, a lot better quality companies coming to market, both in Shanghai and also in the other smaller exchanges they have. Also seeing some really good quality companies from China going to markets elsewhere. Hong Kong, for example, if we look at the MSCI China Index, it has substantially outperformed the S&P 500 this year and over the last 12 months. We just had a phenomenal IPO in Hong Kong a couple of days ago by CATL, the world's leading battery company, which is based in China but decided to list in Hong Kong. We've got some good quality companies trading in New York as well, on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. But there's also a lot of old history of bad quality companies that should have been delisted that haven't yet. So it's like everything. You have to be really careful about which company you invest in.
Yeah. And really the last question I had for you, Andy, as it relates to investors, if you look out 5 years from now, what do you think the most likely scenario for U.S.-China economics relations is, and how should companies and investors kind of position themselves for that outcome?
Right now, it's really difficult to predict what the next couple of decades are going to look like because we're at this tipping point that I referred to earlier where President Trump's going to have to decide whether to put things back on a more constructive course or not. I think the Chinese are eager to be constructive. But even if it doesn't work out well at the political level here, we all still have to live in a global economy.
Yeah.
And there is no data that indicates that globalization is stopping. Everybody's talking about that, but we're still globally dependent. Like the International Energy Agency says, I think 19 out of the leading 20 critical minerals for energy are processed primarily in China.
Yeah.
So we can't escape that. We also don't want, I think, our kids to grow up so that they can screw little screws into iPhones. We want them to grow up to be the designers of the technology that goes in those iPhones, the designers of the software that goes into those iPhones. And in order to make those and sell them at scale, we need low-wage manufacturing, whether it's in China or India. We need that globalization. And companies need to not lose sight of that.
That was Andy Rothman, whose firm Sinology advises institutional investors and companies on the opportunities and risks presented by China's economy and U.S.-China relations. And given what's going on in the world, a service like this has never been more valuable. Special thanks to Andy for sharing his insights with us today, and we'll be sure to have him back on down the road as these trade negotiations proceed. If you found this episode insightful, please subscribe to the show on your podcast app and throw us a 5-star rating. It'll really help us grow the show, get more interesting voices on the podcast. We appreciate it. I'm Tom Ryan. We'll see you next time back in the arena.
References to specific stocks are not intended to be recommendations for specific trading behavior. Comments presented on this podcast are intended for informational and educational purposes only, and do not represent opinions or recommendations on whether to buy, sell, or hold shares of a particular stock. All investors are advised to conduct their own independent research into individual stocks before making a trading decision. In addition, investors are advised that past stock performance is no guarantee of future price performance.